The personal views expressed by our podcast guests are their own.
Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest on the show today, Aparna Bhushan. She is the co-host of the Rethinking Tech podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. You and I connected on LinkedIn, and we actually had a chat, and it was very insightful. And I love the fact that you intersect with tech, policy, and also I really adore the fact that you try to bring in kind of geopolitical parts of what you're talking about. But why don't you give us a preview of your background and how you became the co-host of this podcast?
For sure. And I will say shout out to LinkedIn for connecting us. It's one of the beauties of this hyper-connected world we live in. But a little bit about me. I'm a data protection and governance lawyer by background and licensed in the US and Canada. But more than that, over my career, I've really focused on helping organizations think critically about how they collect, use, and govern data in a way that actually serves people. So I started my career helping organizations of all sizes. So I was at a startup, then I went to a bigger organization like Ford Motor Company, and I've also worked across tech companies to global organizations. And I've always done it with the purpose and the goal of bringing structure to how we handle data in ways that are meaningful, ethical, and practical. And with that lens, it just felt like a natural hop, step, and leap to starting Rethinking Tech. As you mentioned, very much focused on that intersection area of gray between geopolitics, data, ethics, and I would argue in today's world, especially given changing government around the globe, it's become all the more relevant to see how these things are connected. My co-host and I, we met while we were consulting for UNICEF. And we started having these conversations on a daily basis. And we're like, you know what? Let's just hit record. And if there are people out there who are as interested in these topics as us, let's start this conversation with them. And we really strive to provide that non-judgmental space because in this ever divisive world, it's nice to not add extra fuel to fire and just talk about things from a practical perspective. That's what we try to do.
Well, I love that lens. And as we talked about before, I love the fact that you bring that in. So what I tell people, because I talk about geopolitics as well, not as much as I need to. I'm glad we're able to talk about it today, but it's kind of the things that are happening that are kind of not written that influence everything else, that maybe the things that are not said. And I think also one of the really unfortunate things that happen in some of these heated debates where people are so polarized. It's like, I have something to say. I'm not going to listen to what you have to say. And I want you to think like me. And I don't think that's the way we should be, right? So it should be more of an open space, dialogue, more accepting space. But I want your thoughts on the whirlwind of things that are happening today. And obviously they impact policy, they impact how people or companies are working in tech. And also there's that human factor. So, things like whether organizations are going to regulate or enforce things, whether tech companies are going to take seriously, not just regulation, but how consumers feel about how their data is handled. I think it's a really big deal. And then all the other things in between. Give me your thoughts about what's happening today that have caught your attention and has your focus right now that you think we should be thinking about.
Debbie, such a good question. And literally what I grapple with every single day, because there is so much in this news cycle that I feel like things that I record 1 week are irrelevant 2 days later. But you touched on some really interesting stakeholders. So why don't I break it down that way? Let's look at it through the lens of companies. Let's look at it through the lens of users, you and I, or consumers. And then let's look at it through the lens of government. And let's start from bigger all the way down, because I like to talk about users, the most important ones, I think, last. So let's look at government. At the government layer, everything is not making sense anymore because the rules that had been written have been completely thrown out the window. And it reminds me a lot of having a bully on the playground sometimes, and the bully gets to decide what's being done, even if other people disagree. And no names to be taken, but right now, all the other countries and all countries worldwide are figuring out how to properly respond to this completely new way of playing, this completely new field. So, what I think we're going to start seeing from a government perspective is governments are now going to either start redefining their alliances and redefining their priorities. You're either going to see them double down on things like freedom of expression, which is interpreted differently by different governments, making it even harder for companies and users to figure out. And you're also going to see them realign themselves in alliances that might seem strange or that might make perfect sense because that's what's been done historically. You're seeing this come out of the China and South Korea and Japan relationship that's had some negotiations. And now you're starting to see some frays at the edge between Canada and Canadian, the US and the US and Mexico. So we're in a weird, but also really interesting time to see how these puzzle pieces are now going to fit in this whole new puzzle. And then you look at it from the company perspective, and geez, to be a company that's global, it really makes no sense right now because how do you appease one government without setting another one? So for companies to now develop internal policies and try not to rock the boat, it almost hurts them to have that public facing space. And it's almost better to just step back and almost hope you get swallowed into the shadows until things settle a little, because the worst thing you can do right now is trigger a government or trigger an entity to then target you. And then you'll see things like the FTC coming after you. You'll see things like deals not being allowed, or you'll see perhaps your company not being allowed to operate in a geography altogether. We've seen this with DeepSeek in Italy. We're seeing this maybe with TikTok, which is a really interesting thing to talk about. So I do not envy companies, especially as they then look at their employees and what is it that they're going to allow their employees to do. Are employees allowed to speak out about these things? Because then doesn't that represent the company's interests? But if the company tells the employee not to, what does that mean for the company's overall culture? And we saw a lot of this coming out of Silicon Valley around election time and around the Me Too movement, and especially around the Black Lives Matter movement. But now you're seeing companies that had one perspective that you thought you aligned with completely change. So culture is completely changing. And then the last layer, arguably the most important layer, is what does this mean for you and I, for users? And when using certain social media platforms, for example, you have to be careful now. You're hearing these stories about people trying to cross borders and not being careful and not knowing, and their laptops being searched and their phones being searched. And I mean, I have a podcast, you have a podcast. I have been told by several people to be careful about what it is that I'm saying online. And I believe I'm just reporting on facts, but it's a weird time. And so I don't know if I'm giving you the answer you're looking for, other than the fact that it's a lot of unknown right now.
That's a great answer. Something that I talk about is something I think about that I want your thoughts about. So moving into a space politically where people, are thinking that maybe either certain administrations won't want to slash regulations, don't want to regulate, don't want to create new laws, especially around privacy, may not be interested in enforcing laws. I think it caused some companies to pull back on privacy a bit to their peril. And the reason why I say that is because, well, a couple things. One is that there's still that consumer element where if people aren't happy with what you do, that could be worse than a regulation. I tell people, like, regulation is not your biggest problem. Like, your consumers are your biggest problem. So if you don't think of it that way, you're going to be in a bad position. But then also in the U.S. on the state level, and then in other government levels in different countries, we're still seeing enforcement, right? Maybe enforcement that people don't like because it creates more complexity because it's coming at you from like different angles. So like the example you gave, like OpenAI got fined in Italy, right? or GM has this big case against them in Texas, right? So all these things are still happening, right? Even though in the US, we don't have federal, regulation. But I think, I do a talk called Beyond Regulation. That's one of the first things I talked about this year. And so, and I talked about don't be so focused on regulation because you have all these other risks that you need to think about. And so I'll tell you a story quickly. I want your thoughts. So think Kashmir Hill from the New York Times did a story about GM and them selling people's data to data brokers, and then their insurance went up and stuff. And so that was a blockbuster type of article. And so a couple things happened. First of all, and I read through all of her articles. I went through all the comments. I just read because I wanted to see what people were saying. People were outraged. They were like, I've been a GM car owner for generations and I'll never, use this company again and all this stuff. And to me, that seems like that's a huge risk to take to make a couple $100 a year from a person, right? So you're gonna lose all this
Yes.
money. And so I actually ended up at an event, a mobility data event with like a lot of automakers, a lot of insurance makers. And they said it was so funny because they were like, after that happened, we were all saying, okay, we're following the law, quote unquote, right? But there's more than that, right? So there's a gap between what companies do and what consumers expect. And a lot of them like, well, we threw out our playbooks and we're kind of doing something differently. So you need to really think about that consumer angle. But I said all that to have you give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, and you can see it from two different angles. One is that laws are reactionary. So let's say you're doing something, you're an innovative company, you're deciding to resell your customers' data because there's no law out there. But let's say there isn't. Cool, fine, you're not breaching the law yet, but A, that's because laws are reactionary. So that means you might be the case in point example. You might be the one taken to court being like, ooh, actually, new jurisdiction is going to come out. And how embarrassing would that be? But, and this is the most important thing, it always comes back to the consumer. I am always telling the organizations that I consult for that compliance is not the goal. You should be making data protection your superpower. Why would you not? You're looking to improve the user's UI, UX experience. You're looking to improve their ability to access their data, to understand what the heck you're doing with their data. You're looking to make them confident in the way that you process their data. This is only a good thing. If you are confident in what it is that you're offering, then you should be showing that off. So make it as easy and as simple as possible. If you do not want to do that, it's probably because you're not doing something that you feel all that great about. In which case, is it worth doing? Like you said, is it worth a couple $100 a year per user max? Or would you rather look at that lifetime value of that customer and reevaluate what your actual priorities are?
Yeah, totally. I want your thoughts on something that's happening in the news right now. Tons happening in the news, but I want your thoughts on this particular one, and that's the
Okay.
23andMe situation.
Mhm.
So 23, just a short version. So 23andMe was a company, did DNA. People want to know their ancestry, stuff about their health, and then it became kind of a honeypot for governments and different companies to try to get data and try to get insights and use it for stuff that people didn't expect, like chasing down your cousin because he stole a car or something like that. Or it's also the good stories about maybe family members that found other family members, which is fine. But I think, and I did a video about 5 years ago about this, and my concern was like, what would happen if this company went bankrupt? Or what would happen if this company
Mhm.
got sold to another company and they decided, well, we don't care about protecting your data. We're going to use your data for something else. And so the laws currently aren't written to basically they can sell that data to anyone. Like you really have no control over that. And so that's just kind of a concerning to me. It's kind of like a nightmare scenario in terms of what's going to happen next with people's data that they gave to this one company that may go to this or some other company. What do you think?
Well, first of all, kudos to you for calling this 5 years ago. I wish that I had talked to you and known you then, because back in 2015, confession, I fell for the marketing. I fell for the Black Friday deals. I was like, this is going to be a fantastic Christmas present for my family. I bought it for all of them. terrible idea. But that being said, it was a shoe-in for best Christmas present that year. So at least I won in my mom's eyes that year. That being said, when I actually started learning about the data protection implications of this, I was flabbergasted. I mean, you just mentioned that yes, they've declared bankruptcy. And now with it, the genetic data of 15 million users is now up for grabs. Fortunately, I'm not one of them, neither is my family, because I got us to a few years ago when I realized what a treasure trove of data was now at risk. I got us to get all of our data deleted to the best of our knowledge. That's the other piece. Like, yes, we hope that the companies that say they're doing these things are actually doing these things, although fairly sure there was a security incident just like a couple of years ago with 23andMe. So in terms of what data was actually deleted, whether it was pseudonymized, anonymized, and you never really know unless you yourself are going to audit this organization, in which case good luck as a user doing that. But I digress. Your question was, how do I feel about it? I have so many feelings about it. As you said, your DNA it will be sold to the highest bidder. And when this company's bankrupt, that's really the only asset they have that anybody will want that's worth anything. And best case scenario, it goes to an organization that won't do anything harmful with it. But worst case scenario, I mean, it can go to a foreign government with questionable motives. It can go to those insurance companies that you already just mentioned, the GM case. If I see my insurance premiums going up, I will naturally suspect that it has something to do with this data that's out there. And that's really, really scary. Like, can this lead to a different form of discrimination? Something that you and I have dedicated our careers to fighting, and now it's just out there. I mean, this data is just out there. How are we ever going to get it back? We're not. Our data, our most sensitive, valuable data is out there. And as best as I think I've deleted that data, I will never know for sure whether it actually is all gone, which is terrifying.
Well, I'm just super tinfoil hat about stuff like this. And so I think mostly just because my career in technology started when I was trying to move people from paper or analog systems to digital. And I saw some of the things that people were capable of doing that you couldn't do before. And so it got me frightened about some of the things that people were doing. And I was like, oh my goodness, it'd be terrible if they did this or they did that. But then what I find, and I want your thoughts on this, is that I think people just don't imagine what could you possibly do with this data, right? Because it seems so innocent, right? The DNA example. I don't think anybody ever thought that the use cases that they had, the people that they will be allowed to even use this data for these other things. But I think part of the issue with data protection and privacy is that for people who don't really, for people who say, a lot of people say, oh, I don't care, or I have nothing to hide, those people, if I talk to them for 5 minutes, they're like, in uproar, right? They're like, their faces red, they're like upset. Hey, I gave this company my data for one reason, you're using it for another. Like, that's like totally, like, people expect that, right? So with the DNA example, people didn't expect that data would ever be used for anything other than that. So the idea of that kind of scope creep or mission creep is so prevalent, unfortunately, in kind of a data space. And I think that's the part that people don't really think about. But I want your thoughts.
Yes, 100%. And 23andMe is just one example. Is it highly sensitive data? Yes. But let's think about how users are interacting with this exact same use case in other aspects of their life. Social media posts, anything that people have posted on LinkedIn with their job updates. I've seen people get into issues when they're going through any online dating forums. And even if you are using things like ChatGPT or any other AI model and you haven't specifically turned that feature off to be learned from your data, you are contributing to this algorithm. And my favorite line is that the devil is in the defaults. The default of many of these services, especially in the US, less so in Europe because of regulations, means that all of our data is probably already opted into unless we go through the painstaking effort of opting out, figuring out how to opt out. And the reason that I think a lot of people say they don't care about this or that they're fine with their data being out there is because it's exhausting for the average person to be living in this perpetual, not fear, but awareness of what this means. And it makes life more difficult because you're constantly questioning why certain pieces of data are asked for or where it's going. And I mean, it's not the most fun thing to talk about at a dinner party conversation. I mean, not for me, I enjoy it, but my partner has requested me to dial it down so that we can make more friends, which is fair, which is fair.
Yeah, right.
Uh,
That's hilarious. Oh my goodness. I know, I know. I try to, like, if I go to Christmas party or something like that, I try to just have like maybe one thing that I can leave people with. Like the text messages you get about tolls or whatever, those are scams. Like don't
oh,
click on those.
please. I got that yesterday. Oh my gosh, my poor grandfather was convinced he was getting a brand new iPhone for $15. He
Hmm.
gave all of his information, and I was like, I have failed. I have failed as a granddaughter.
I know it's just really hard, but then that goes back to the imagination thing, right? Because we just don't imagine. First of all, you don't imagine someone would know anything about who to know you, would contact you, would do something like this. So it's just hard to think about. It's just hard to think about. Um, what's happening in maybe either the regulation or enforcement space that you have your eye on? It's like maybe caught your curiosity.
So in the regulation space, earlier this year, we had the Paris AI Summit. And when big names and big organizations were attending, the expectation or hope was very much that some sort of agreement, not a formal agreement, but at least the parameters of an agreement would come out around AI regulation and what this meant. And this touches on the earlier point we made about how being a company in today's day and age is hard because there's different rules and regulations. And if you're making one country happy, you're making another one unhappy. So at least my hope when people were going into this conference was that the world leaders were going to come out of it and provide companies and users with some sort of framework so that they could keep innovating and do so within the constraints of what is in the best interest of users, those AI regulations. I'm hesitant to say the word regulation because I don't think of it as being anything that firm, but at least the makings of it, at least an agreement of sort, a handshake deal. And so I'm hopeful that that'll happen. It did not happen. Long story short, TLDR, like that did not happen. It was the most opposite thing could have happened coming out of that AI Paris summit. We see that the EU and the US, two major players in this game, are seemingly at polar opposite ends of the innovation versus data protection, AI regulation space. And if you'll talk to me and ask my opinion, I don't think belong on the opposite end of the spectrum. I believe that innovation will be moved forward at a lightning speed if you provide those constraints. And so the space I'm watching right now is the EU AI Act, which came into effect earlier this year, but it might be revitalized, to use that term. I would love to see something come out of the US, but you and I both know that's not happening. Maybe at the state level, we'll see something happening, but at the federal level, there's no way. We've been waiting on that data protection regulation for years. So anything that has evidence of an AI act, be it in Asia, be it in Europe, be it in Oceania, even I'm in Brazil right now, anything that provides some evidence to what the eventual global perspective will be on AI is something that I'm gravitating to. It's kind of like how GDPR set the stage for data protection way back in the day.
That's a fascinating point. I'm glad you brought that up. So what GDPR did, and maybe some of my European counterparts may disagree with this, because I know a lot of my European friends, although they were happy with the GDPR, they were also frustrated that they felt like the enforcement was very slow or lacking, right? But what GDPR did, well, as you said, it did set the stage, but it was, in absence of anything else, it was kind of the only thing we could all hold on to. And so what happened after that is that a lot of laws and regulations, even though they didn't wholesale take on GDPR, they took bits and pieces of it. So you cannot even look at almost any law around data protection now and not see it have some lineage of GDPR. And so I think that's what's going to happen with the AI Act, regardless of what tweaks that they do, because I think, in my view, it's hard to kind of dance to the tune of the jurisdiction that has the most rules, basically. So for me in the US, and I want your thoughts, I feel like I know people say, "Oh, we want to lead in AI and stuff like that." I say, well, just because we may not ever have regulation of AI in the US doesn't mean that there won't be regulation elsewhere. And we're going to have to dance by that tune, right? And then from a business perspective, is it necessarily in your best interest to have different requirements or different things for different jurisdictions? Like, for example, so PayPal decided that for the CCPA in California, we're going to make sure we give these people these rights where they can, opt out and do different things. And they decided as a company that they were going to also extend those types of rights to everyone in the US, right? And so that's what I think we're seeing more. So we're going to see more as opposed to, you're in this jurisdiction and you have to comply to these laws with you saying, okay, if you want to do business with me, I need you to align with these regulations because this is how we run our business. But I want your thoughts.
Yeah, and CCP is a fantastic example because there's no way that companies, and yet from the company level, there's no way that companies have the bandwidth, the resources, and frankly, just the interest in catering to each country, let alone each state separately. It's just not feasible. You look at the GPC, the Global Privacy Control, companies are struggling with this. First, they have to implement it and figure out how to do that, which is difficult. So you have to figure out your entire backend ecosystem to read this signal. And then to make it so that only some narrow jurisdictions, what are you going to go off of longitude and latitude? Or what is this to determine whether that control should be enacted? It's not reasonable. It's not feasible. So by that token, looking at it from a global scale, I would agree that the EU and having the AI Act and going off of what we've seen with GDPR will set that baseline. I mentioned that I consult for IGOs, like international governmental organizations like the UN, and those organizations are not held to any legal standards like the rest of us are. They have their own set of requirements. They're called policies. And I mentioned this because even for them, when I am advising them, I use GDPR as my base. It is what's being done worldwide. Even though they're not held to the same requirements, GDPR has what now the privacy world sees, for better or worse, and I know there are some worse, but for better or for worse, provides that standard baseline. And then as much as you choose to deviate, at least you understand that that's the baseline and you're making the decision to deviate. It gives you a starting frame of reference. By the EU putting the AI Act out first, it's fascinating because arguably they don't have the technology that should give them the right to make those regulations. And that's what the US is coming back there. They're like, hey, this is our product. We should get to decide the regulations around it. But by being first to bat, they might have just decided the game rules for the entire AI space. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of friction, especially with the current administration, for them to be like, all of the innovation, all the technology is coming from here. So why do we have to play by your rules? And we didn't see that fight with GDPR, which is why I'm curious to see how this is going to net out.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I just feel and I agree with you wholeheartedly. So we'll definitely see. Maybe there'll be some middle ground there or some tweaking. But to me, it's like you can't replace something with nothing. So
Exactly.
I feel like you have to have something. So I think what they're saying is like, we want nothing. You have something and we want nothing. So it just doesn't work that way. So you have to have something, right?
I agree. I agree. And short of having that, we're going to default to what we have, which is the EU AI Act. I
Exactly.
agree.
I want your thoughts on, I feel like you're the perfect person to ask this because you understand the tech, you understand the policy parts, and also the geopolitical stuff. So I want your thoughts on age verification laws. It's kind of a lot of shenanigans that are going to be happening here, but I've been telling people, I feel like I'm Paul Revere, like the British are coming. I'm trying to warn people about what this means, right? Because I feel like I think globally people think, oh, it's a great idea to protect kids, right? But then we see countries try to take the different ways to do it, where we have, for example, maybe the UK, they're like, well, we can protect children by weakening encryption for everybody. Or we can protect children, like Australia is like, well, we keep kids under 16 off social media. Or in something like, let's say Louisiana, I believe, there a lot of some of the southern states in the US or red states are saying, well, why don't we just have for certain sites, everyone give their ID, regardless of whether you're a kid or not. And so that's bonkers as well. And so what I'm telling people is that as you're creating these regulations, people don't understand what it will take to actually implement them. So, like I tell a parent, think about your kid being on social media. Like, would you give your own ID as a parent to like 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 different social media platforms for your kid to be on? I mean, you just have to think through what this means in terms of like real life. But I want your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's so commendable that governments are recognizing that this is a problem. Because yes, age verification and children being on social media is an issue if it is not properly provided with the appropriate parameters. And that's where the crux of the issue is, those parameters. No one is saying that children should have unfettered access to social media. Yes, they do right now, for what it's worth. And for that, we've seen a huge uptick in suicide rates, huge decline in social behavior learnings. And that's a whole other topic that we can have a discussion about. It's really, really sad. But when it comes to how do you actually enforce and what is the appropriate way to enforce age verification standards? Unfortunately, we have more examples of what not to do than what to do. At the end of the day, I would argue that ID verification is terrifying. I don't want to give my driver's license, or God knows what, or my facial recognition system or something to an unknown third party to then just store, because likely these social media platforms, which I also frankly do not trust, building it in-house or giving it to a third party, it's terrifying. We just talked about the 23andMe example. What if these companies go bankrupt? How do we know how secure these companies are? Like this is not the solution in its current form. In terms of banning access to social media, as fantastic as a thought that that might be, we all know how the black market works. As soon as you take alcohol off of the market, that's when all the speakeasies pop up. And children will find a way to get to it. So unfortunately, I don't think a straight up ban is going to be possible. I'm very curious as to what that technology would look like without then also requiring ID verification. And weakening encryption is never a good idea. Like, no, we should be strengthening encryption. So unfortunately, I think I just answered your question by telling you all the things that people should not be doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It, it's difficult. I'm curious to hear how you are actually guiding the companies that you're working with when it comes to solutions, because the ideas that I've come up with have all been around quickly deleting verification of photo ID, like so that you're not actually storing anything. But then that requires them to build out a process in-house, and we've evaluated using third parties. But candidly, there's nothing that I've been super excited about that's scalable across startups to big companies.
It's funny because I did a address for TikTok, and the topic was technology, social media for you. And someone asked me that question. I was like, well, yeah, that's the like $1 billion question everybody wants to answer, right? How do you
Mhm.
actually do age verification for children? And so one of the things, and I agree with you, if you have to collect it at all, to verify the information, you should, delete it as soon as possible. But one thing that I think that companies need to think about, and this, something I term actual knowledge. We're seeing some cases around this where, for example, I think Weight Watchers, they got into trouble with the FTC for some data that they were collecting on children. And like, you know how like all the apps, they say, oh, click this box if you're over 13, right? And then they assume that you're over the age. But what the FTC did with their investigation, they were like, kids are like, as they were chatting or doing different things, they were like, today's my 8th birthday. kindergarten. I'm in elementary school. So they were like, as the person was using the app, they were providing additional information that would have told you that this person was not of age. And so I think it's sort of thinking about age verification as a gate where you just say, hey, I'm over this age, I get in, I do whatever. I think companies are gonna have to develop more technology because I guess to me this is an example of why technology is a double-edged sword because you're collecting so much information, and then on the flip side it's like the fact that you have all that information and you can do all these other wacky things with it. Why can't you use it to tell if someone of a certain age? So yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic point because it's always these companies that are full of the most brilliant minds that when we ask them questions like this, they're like, I don't know, it's really hard. Like, how do we figure that out? And it's like, you figured out how to get us addicted to your algorithm so that I am now mindlessly scrolling for hours. I know you are smart. You guys figure this out. But to your point, like maybe this is a good use case for AI. Maybe this is a way that we get these AI agents or bots to work in the background and look for things like birthdays and numbers. And that's what you could then trigger for your content moderation team to review or whatever it may be. Like there are solutions out there. I refuse to believe any company that says it's too hard because that's you telling me that you're not that intelligent. And I know that no one will admit to that.
Yeah, even as I said, I went to a mobility conference and someone was saying that they know how much water is in the wheel well of your car at any given moment. I'm like, surely you should be able to figure out how old someone is. I think companies have not been incentivized to use their innovation in that way. And so I'm hoping that they spend time to do that because I think is a very important thing to do. And then I think, and I want your thoughts on this as well. I think one of the big problems that we have with age verification is that we're trying to take something that happens in a physical world and try to recreate it in a digital world. And I don't think it works, right? So I think us thinking, digital is different. So we have to think about our digital space differently.
Yeah, for sure. And unfortunately, there is no silver bullet solution. I think you actually addressed this in the Weight Watchers example, which is that it will be very specific to each organization. Does that mean that no organization should go through it? No. It just means that every organization needs to figure it out. The same way they have a unique product or service or offering, this is the exact same. How do you make this make sense for you?
I think some companies haven't invested there because they may not see that return on investment, but maybe the return on investment is that you're not losing people, right? Or that you're providing more of a safe space where parents feel comfortable sending their kids these things. So yeah, a lot to think about.
For sure, for sure. And it's a fascinating space. I think we'll see a lot of development. I hope to see a lot of positive development in the coming year.
Yeah, definitely. So if it were the world according to you and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether that be regulation, human behavior, or technology?
Oh, good question. I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna answer them two ways. So in terms of human behavior and technology, so human behavior, I would love for people to just be more conscious when they're making the decisions they're making, not just to give data because blank form, someone's Google Doc is asking you for it, but to really question the purpose of it. And then if they decide that they're fine to give their social security number, which I really hope they're not, to a random person, but you know what? But at least they're aware. They're making that conscious decision. So many times we're unconsciously on autopilot and we're not actually thinking about the repercussions and the real world implications. So that would be my one beg, my one desire, my one ask of the audience and of the world. And then the second on the technology piece, we were just talking about what really interesting and really intelligent technologists can do. Is there any way for us to now build an AI auditing software that can audit AI so that when these models are being developed, when these models are going out there and collecting data to ensure that it's not biased, to ensure that it's not discriminatory, to ensure that everyone is equally represented and that personal information is not misused, like that would be a dream come true. I'm hopeful that there are some really intelligent people out there using it, but using AI to audit AI would be a great piece of technology.
I agree. I think we need to be more creative here and spend some more time and money on this problem because it is a hard problem. And yeah, I love the fact that you cheated with your two answers, and I agree with them both. So it has to be like, should I give my biometrics for a $10 coupon to Amazon? Probably not. It's probably not worth it, right? But as long as people have that transparency, then they can make like an informed choice.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. Oh my gosh, to be able to talk with you today. And I look forward to us being able to collaborate in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed thinking about these things from your perspective and my perspective, and I can't wait to see what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, me too. Me too. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thanks.